The Frumkes Center for Writing and Culture at Hunter College presents 10 years of best-selling authors and great thinkers.
My name is Frumkes. I'm the director of the Writing Center, CE at Hunter, and we are very happy to have you here. As many of you know, this is the concluding event of our Spring Best-Selling Author Series, and on your chairs should be a flyer of the Summer Symposium, which is an abbreviated version, I guess, of what used to be our conference, which people, it was a long, everybody loved it, but it was like 12 panels, a long day. We didn't end up making a great deal of money on it, and we decided to make it more attractive by cutting the price in half, having the same good speakers, and also doing some exciting panels, thus the literary roadshow, where you can make a pitch to the various people, the acquiring editors that are on the panel and others. And there's a panel called Book to Film, led by Warren Adler, who wrote The War of the Roses. And we have a distinguished fiction panel, on which Amanda Filipacchi, who's speaking tonight, will be one of the panelists, along with Susan Isaacs and a number of others who you may or may not know, but who you will be delighted with because they have outsized talent. And the speakers are Daphne Merkin and Joyce Carol Oates. I think either of the speakers is worth the fee alone. But we will also have a wine and cheese reception, networking reception, and a lot of good spirit and fun, and a box lunch if you, those who want, those who do not, you're free to go out. So, am I dragooning you into coming? Not exactly, but trying to whet your appetite. But in the meanwhile, let me tell you about Amanda Filipacchi, who I think is one of the most talented writers around, and if you, well, let me introduce her for you. As you know, if you read the brochure of our events for the spring at Hunter College, I think Amanda Filipacchi, who has just returned from France, is an extraordinary new talent. The fact that there is not a larger crowd here tonight, and I knew that because we only had about 50 people sign up, and we should have had hundreds, and if she repeats, you'll find that there will be hundreds, is sad testimony. Not a large crowd is sad testimony that not enough people recognize that fact yet. However, if you read Sarah Lyall's review of The Unfortunate Importance of Beauty, her new novel, in this past Sunday's New York Times book review, a rave review I might add, you will see that Amanda's profile is about to rise, and you will be among the fortunate few who met and read her early. Not that she doesn't have fans already. Anyone who has read Nude Men, Vapor, or Love Creeps is in love with her already. They know that Amanda's books, to quote Sarah Lyall, are by turns funny, surreal, absurd, and charmingly preposterous. I don't think more needs to be said, except that Amanda, like her books, is funny, surreal, charmingly preposterous, and shy. So just know that this beautiful, quirky, talented writer standing here tonight before you is probably shaking in her boots. So be gentle with her, and when she is finished, be smart, have her inscribe one of her books to you or one of your friends. You will be happy you did. Amanda?
Thank you so much for that incredibly nice introduction. So, Louis told me at first that I should just come up here and talk, and finally I asked him if could I please just read from something and not wing it. And he grudgingly said, okay. And then he instructed me today to be really relaxed. And so I said I can't fight my personality, you know, sorry. But, okay, so I guess I'm supposed to talk about my writing life, or my life as a writer, or something like that, so I tried. I was born and raised in France, mostly in France, except for 2 years between the ages of 10 and 12 when we lived in Pound Ridge, New York. My father was French and my mother American. I'm not one of those writers who can say she's always written from her earliest days. Even though I loved reading novels, I never had an urge to write until I was forced to do so at the age of 13 in a creative writing class. We were living in France, and in French schools, they don't have creative writing classes. They don't believe that writers can be taught to write. But one year, when I was 13, I happened to be enrolled in the American School of Paris, where they did have a creative writing class, and we were forced to write one short story a week. This is where I discovered that I was better at writing stories than at anything else I had done in my life. People's very positive reactions gave me such a high that I decided to try to experience that high over and over again for the rest of my life. That's when and why I decided to become a writer. I had to decide if I wanted to be a writer in English or French. I decided English because I knew it was easier for American writers to end up translated into French than the other way around. So from that point on, I focused on improving my English and neglected my French. As a teenager in France, I wrote a novel at home but never showed it to anyone, and I doubt it was very good. For most of my teenage years, I was in an international school in France based on the French education system, which meant there were no creative writing classes at all in that school, and I craved them. After finishing high school in France, I decided to move to the States to try to be a novelist in America. I went to Hamilton College, and then I took creative writing classes every chance I got. I wrote short stories, but outside of class, I also wrote 2 novels in college, one in 1 month and one in 2 months. I never really showed them to anyone. I doubt they were very good. After college, I entered the Columbia MFA program in creative writing. At first, I was very intimidated to be in that program because I had heard so much about it. But when the time came for me to submit my first piece for workshop, I was very nervous. I wasn't sure my writing would be as good as the other students. I submitted the beginnings of 2 novels and asked the class to vote on which one they preferred. They preferred the one called Nude Men, so I went with that one. I took a writing workshop there with Alice Quinn, who was an editor at The New Yorker. She loved the novel that I was writing, Nude Men. I took her class again a year later, and all the students were supposed to have a private conference with her. And when I had mine, she said, "You're still writing the same novel?" I said, "Yes." And she said, "Well, do you have an agent?" I said, "No, I hadn't even looked for one yet because I hadn't finished writing my novel." She said, "I would like to recommend you to an agent I think would be good for you. Her name is Melanie Jackson." I said, "Okay." I found out soon after that this agent was the wife and agent of Thomas Pynchon, so I was excited. That agent took me on when I was 23 years old. I'm now 47 and I'm still with her. She sold my first novel, Nude Men, to Nan Graham at Viking. Nan Graham insisted on having world rights to my novel, and because Viking has the best guy in the business for selling foreign rights, so I've been told, he sold my novel to about 10 countries very quickly, including France. That was one of the most exciting times in my life. When Nan Graham accepted my novel for Viking, by then I had turned 24, I was so happy I couldn't sleep. And when the novel came out, I bought a pair of rollerblades and skated from store to store in Manhattan to count the copies each day to see how many had been sold since the previous day. I enjoyed catching customers looking at my book, and sometimes I walked right up to them and talked to them. I was invited by several of my foreign publishers to fly over and stay a while to do interviews. I flew to France, London, Frankfurt, Holland, and Milan. I took way too long to write my second novel, and my third, 6 years each. In 2001, when I was 34, I finished writing my third novel, Love Creeps. It was a black comedy about love and relationships with a very negative take on the possibility of finding true love. This was right after 9/11. Everyone was depressed, And when I submitted my novel to my agent, she didn't love it as much as she had my other 2 novels. She said it was very dark, even though everyone else who'd read it thought it was hilarious. My agent wanted me to work on it more. I was extremely depressed by this reaction, but as we know, sometimes events in our lives that we think are unfortunate end up causing some of the best things to happen. When my agent told me I needed to work more on my novel, I decided to form a group of writer friends who would critique one another's work just like we used to do in writing workshops, which I missed. I invited a few writer friends, and I needed one more. So I remembered a man I had seen at a reading 6 years before. He had been one of the readers. His name was Richard Hine. He was a friend of mine. He had made an impression on me with his great short story, his amazing red hair, and his British accent. I never forgot him. So I got in touch with him 6 years later and asked him if he would like to join my writing group, which I had decided to name the Fiction Laboratory. He did. We became involved romantically very quickly and have been together ever since for 13 wonderful years. And he's sitting in the back row now. So, after having been very unlucky in love my whole life and having lost hope of ever finding a great life's love, I felt very grateful to my agent for not having loved the first draft of my 3rd novel. There's a similar phenomenon that happened to me one evening 2 years ago. There is a syndrome that a lot of people have called fear of missing out. In the media, it's often referred to by its acronym FOMO. FOMO means that if you get invited to something, like a party, sometimes the reason you force yourself to go, even though you don't feel like it, is fear of missing out. For instance, fear that your future husband or wife will be there and you'll never meet them because you didn't go to the event, or fear that you might miss out on meeting someone who might change the course of your career. We rarely have fear of missing out in reverse, meaning we rarely tell ourselves, I really should not go out to this event this evening because something could happen at home that could potentially change the course of my life. And yet that happened to me. That night, FOMO wasn't strong enough to get me to go out. I had been invited to a screening of a movie based on one of Salman Rushdie's novels, but I was feeling lazy and lethargic, so I stayed home. If I had gone out, I would have missed out on a major event in my life, which might have been a good thing depending on how you look at it. I was at home, looking at Wikipedia, and I noticed something strange. I ended up writing a New York Times op-ed about the strange thing I noticed on Wikipedia. In the op-ed, I explained that what I noticed was that for the past few months, Wikipedia editors had been removing women from the category called American novelists and dumping them in a smaller subcategory called American women novelists, and they were leaving only male novelists in the main category. It was disturbing to see all these well-known female novelists such as Harper Lee, Anne Rice, Amy Tan, Donna Tartt, and hundreds of others being relegated to the ranks of American women novelists, and they no longer appeared in the category American novelists. Male novelists on Wikipedia, however, no matter how small or obscure they were, all got to remain in the category American novelists. It seemed as though no one noticed. I did more digging on Wikipedia and found other familiar names that had been taken out of the main category. Harriet Beecher Stowe, Ann Beattie, Juna Barnes, Emily Barton, Amy Bender, Amy Bloom, Judy Bloom, Alice Adams, Louisa May Alcott, V.C. Andrews, and, upsetting to me, I had been taken out too. I also noticed that Edwidge Danticat had been plucked from Haitian novelists and dumped into Haitian women novelists. So it seemed at least that women from different countries were treated the same. It was just too bad they weren't treated the same as men. An explanation at the top of the page said that the list of American novelists was too long and novelists had to be put in subcategories whenever possible. Women had to be relegated to a subcategory in order to make room for the men in the main category. As is often the case in our society, white males were being treated as the default setting. I happen to belong to an email group of published female novelists. Some of the members are well-known writers. That evening, I sent them an email describing what I had just discovered on Wikipedia. I was immediately deluged by scandalized responses from these female novelists. They urged me to write an article or an op-ed about it. I didn't really want to. Even though I'd had 3 novels published, I had never written nonfiction in my life and found the prospect of having to write an op-ed very intimidating. Plus, I knew it was risky, that if I published an article like this, the Wikipedia biography about me would probably get attacked or at least damaged or diminished in some way by angry Wikipedia contributors. But none of the other female novelists in my email group wanted to write the article either, probably for the same reason. But I felt someone should write it because it was a terrible problem, very unacceptable, and it should not be allowed to continue for 1 second longer. So even though I knew I'd be putting myself at risk, I decided to be the one to write it. Since I didn't know how to tackle writing an op-ed, I wondered if perhaps the email I had written to the female writers might be good enough to be the op-ed, and perhaps I wouldn't have to do any extra work. So I called my agent, read her the email. She was outraged by it. She sent my email to the New York Times immediately, and the female editor there was also outraged by it and said she was going to publish it as an op-ed immediately, and she did. In that op-ed, which was my email, I pointed out that this sexist subcategorization of women on Wikipedia was a problem because if people went to Wikipedia to get ideas for whom to hire or honor or read, and looked at that list of American novelists for inspiration, they might not even notice that it contained only men. They might simply use that list without thinking twice about it. And I remarked that small, easily fixable things like this contribute to the difficulties women have in gaining equality in the literary world. This op-ed created an uproar against Wikipedia. The scandal was written about in the media in the US and many other countries. People were outraged. Just as I had predicted, as soon as the op-ed came out, various male Wikipedia editors pounced on my Wikipedia biography and basically ripped it to shreds. They did the same to the pages of my novels, the Wikipedia biographies of my parents, and even the Wikipedia page about the company my dad was the head of, because they were angry about the criticism that my op-ed had brought on them. 2 days later, the New York Times asked me to write a second op-ed, a follow-up to the first, describing what was happening to my Wikipedia biography and the general aftermath of this op-ed. So I did. The attacks on my Wikipedia biography redoubled, and the greatest amount of damage was being done by one person in particular who went by the anonymous username Cordy. When the good guys on Wikipedia, because there are some good guys, tried to stop Cordy from doing all this damage, it seemed to enrage Cordy even more. He started making certain declarations about me publicly on the talk pages of Wikipedia. These declarations were outrageous lies. No one knew if Cordy was a man or a woman. People assumed it was a man, but suddenly in one of the lies, he claimed he was a woman, and he claimed to the world that I had sent thugs who had made death threats against her and her husband and child. Cordy also said other horrible libelous lies about me that I don't even want to repeat here. Another thing he wrote, which was very memorable and chilling, was, quote, "This incident is never going to be forgotten, not by anyone involved in it. Retribution will be taken 5, 10, 15, 20 years from now." End quote. Then, about 2 weeks later, an article by Andrew Leonard came out in Salon.com, unmasking Cordy. It's a fascinating article called "Revenge, Ego, and the Corruption of Wikipedia." Turns out Cordy was not a woman with a husband and child to whom I'd sent thugs who'd made death threats. Turns out he's a man called Robert Clark Young, in his 50s, who lives alone with his parents and never had children. And what's more amazing is, he's a novelist himself, with his own Wikipedia biography, which he had been puffing up anonymously for 6 years while damaging other writers' Wikipedia biographies, especially writers he held grudges against. He had attended the Sewanee Writers' Conference several years before and had taken a writing workshop taught by the highly respected writer Barry Hannah. Barry Hannah had not much liked Cordy's writing, or Robert Clark Young, and neither did another student in the class called Brad Weiss. As a result, Cordy spent years damaging their Wikipedia biographies. When Barry Hannah died, Cordy went to his Wikipedia biography and changed the cause of death to alcoholism, which wasn't true. The Salon article describes all this. As a result of this revelation, Robert Clark Young was banned from Wikipedia for life, even though he was an established Wikipedia editor. He had a history of causing problems on Wikipedia and getting into fights as Cordy. Jimmy Wales, the co-founder of Wikipedia, said after Cordy was unmasked, quote, "For those of us who love Wikipedia, the ramifications of the Cordy saga are not comforting. I would have banned him outright years ago, so would many others, that we did not points to serious deficiencies in our system." Robert Clark Young, aka Cordy, never apologized publicly or privately for what he did, for all the libelous lies he told, for all the authors he hurt, for the careers he destroyed, such as Brad Weiss's, whose career he destroyed by accusing him of plagiarism. The Wikipedia op-ed created a lot of stress for me, and I'm still haunted by the thought that Robert Clark Young may hold true to his threat to take revenge on me for the next 20 years, especially when a new one-star review of my novel shows up on Amazon. So, that was my first experience with writing nonfiction. I knew I'd be taking a risk, but I didn't realize it would be to that degree. The next topic I wrote an essay about was physical appearance and the unfortunate importance it has in people's minds. I described the various times in my life when I had been criticized for my own imperfect physical appearance. That essay was published in the New Yorker online this past December and ended up being on their list of most read essays of 2014, so it hit a nerve, I think. My fourth novel that came out in February is a sort of fictional meditation on beauty, a disapproval of it, but also a celebration of it. I suppose I wrote it because I was born into a family of beautiful people. My mother was a top model. I was the only average-looking member of my family. I was born cross-eyed, had 2 eye surgeries in my childhood to correct this strabismus. I've received remarks in my life about my looks, especially about my big chin. When I was a teenager, a dentist convinced my mother and me to remove 4 of my permanent teeth to discourage my jaw from growing too much. I did it, but it didn't make much difference, I don't think. When my first novel, Nude Men, was about to be published, Viking sent an author-photographer to take my photo for the book jacket. As soon as the photographer saw me, he said, "Don't worry about your chin, I retouch my photos." I said, "What do you mean? What's wrong with my chin?" "Oh, you know," he said, making a vague, swooping gesture along his own jawline. I assume most women have anecdotes like this about remarks that have been made about their looks. So I wrote a novel about the unfortunate importance of beauty, and I called it that. I wasn't thrilled with the cover my publisher Norton chose for my new novel. This is it. The cover was very beautiful, but more feminine than I would have ideally liked. I was worried that the cover would decrease my chances of getting reviewed by serious publications. None of my novels had ever been reviewed by the New York Times, and it was my dream. My novels had gotten great reviews from other good publications, such as the Boston Globe, the Chicago Tribune, the San Francisco Chronicle, but not the New York Times. But I didn't want to be a difficult author with Norton, who was my publisher. They had already changed the cover once at my request, so I decided not to ask them to find a new cover. Instead, I decided I would counteract the cover by other means, starting with my author photo. In order to do this, I had to give up the idea of using a very flattering photo I had for years been looking forward to using as my next author photo. It was a snapshot that my life partner, Richard, had taken of me 8 years ago in the street in Paris at 3 a.m. It was a reflection of me in a mirrored window, and I suspect the mirror must have been slightly curved in a way that greatly improved my looks. I've been using it as my Facebook avatar for a long time. Now, changing plans, I made an appointment with the great author-photographer Mariana Ettlinger. On the phone, I told her I wanted to look stern, severe, strict, grim, basically like a nun, possibly standing against a white wall, maybe wearing a black cloak or something. "Like a headmistress?" she asked. "Yes, exactly," I said. I was thrilled she understood. This past Sunday, the New York Times Book Review published a full-page review of my novel, very positive, with my author photo in big in the middle. I was very happy. A few weeks ago, I wrote an essay describing my photo session with Marian Ettlinger, and this essay was accepted by the New Yorker online and was about to be published in their page-turner section, but when the New Yorker handed me the contract to sign, it contained a clause which gave them the right to purchase film rights, which my agent never likes. This is something Condé Nast now demands for all the essays from new contributors they publish. And they refused to withdraw that clause, so I withdrew my essay, and we resubmitted it somewhere else where it's now under consideration. What I recounted in the essay was that 2 days before the shoot, I flipped through a book of Marian Ettlinger's photos to get a sense of how authors typically dress for their portraits. I happen to own a copy of the book, and I also appear in it because Marian had already photographed me 13 years before. While flipping through the pages, I made a startling discovery. Not about the clothes, but about the poses. The male and female authors posed differently. The men looked simpler, more straightforward. The women looked dreamy, often gazing off into the distance. Their positions were more inventive and extravagant, requiring flexibility. Their limbs were sometimes entwined like vines. I decided right then and there that in my author photo I wanted to pose like a man. I also thought, no wonder books by women don't get reviewed as often as men's. Maybe it was the poses. I made a mental note to alert Vida. Does everyone know what Vida is?
No.
Really? No one? Okay. It's an organization that every once a year they take all the publications, newspapers and magazines, and count the number of books written by women who are reviewed versus the books reviewed written by men, and just to show the incredible imbalance. When the day came, I arrived at Marian Ettlinger's vast and gorgeous studio. Between two comfortable chairs stood a little table on which Ettlinger had laid out a plate of cookies, fruits, and other goodies. She was warm, amusing, sensitive, and made me feel loved. But when I enthusiastically told her that I now wanted to pose like a man, a faintly troubled expression flitted across her face. I hadn't realized or hadn't remembered how much preparation Marian puts into her photo shoots. Her whole approach to that day's session had been based on the assumption that I would be posing like a woman. She had found previous portraits to serve as inspiration for the severe look I was aiming for. I felt bad that I hadn't given her more notice. Nevertheless, my vision was too important to me. I couldn't abandon it. I mentioned to her that there was a photo of Jonathan Franzen that was really phenomenal. I couldn't remember if she had taken it. I searched for it online on my iPhone and found it. I showed it to her. She hadn't taken it. Yes, it is very good, she said. My unspoken message to her was, please make me look vaguely like him. When I explained to her that I'd had my realization when looking through her book, Marian took out a copy of her book and asked me to show her other man poses I might want to emulate. She wanted to look at every page of her book with me. She put post-it notes on the good man poses. I was very touched by her considerateness. Then we tried to have me replicate the poses. Turns out many were not as simple and straightforward as they looked. How did Junot Diaz get his arm here when his leg was there? My most successful pose ended up being a combination of the Daniel Mendelsohn and the Jonathan Dee. During the shoot, I thought a lot about my mother and her former life as a model. I felt sorry for her to have had to pose every day for years. It's harder than most people think, or at least it is for me, probably owing to the muscle loss that comes with being a writer. Midway through the session, which lasted a whole afternoon, Marian said, "You look like a member of a gang of female mountain warriors." I took this as a compliment. A short while later, she interrupted her photo taking and walked over to me looking slightly uncomfortable. She seemed to want to broach a difficult topic. Finally, she said, "Did you happen to see X's most recent author photo?" X being the name of a famous female author whose real identity I will keep private. I said I believed I had. "Didn't you think it was a little too stern?" she asked gently. "Don't you think sometimes an expression can be a little too tight to the point that it almost looks angry?" I nodded, and then I explained to her what had happened. About an hour and a half into our shoot, I had forgotten to focus on the thought I had intended to be thinking during the session. I am of the opinion that one's thoughts can influence one's appearance. And so for the shoot, I had not only brought a suede jacket, which is actually this one, and a new shirt, I had also prepared a thought to think. In my thought, a book reviewer at my dream publication, which was the New York Times, was sitting in front of a pile of books trying to decide which ones to review. Coming upon mine, the reviewer looked at the cover skeptically, about to fling it aside dismissively, which is understandable, it was this cover. Then, at the last minute, flipped to the author photo page and became confused. How could a book with a cover that beautiful have an author photo that ugly, in a good way? The reviewer decided right then that the book should be reviewed. I explained to Marian that the thought I was wearing to enhance the look I was striving for had started degenerating without my realizing it into a corrupted version of itself, focusing instead on the statistics Vita publishes every year, showing how many books by men get reviewed at various dream publications versus how many books by women, and how grim those numbers are for the women. This new degraded thought must have given my features an angry look that had become impossible for Marian to ignore. Some people feel that a book speaks for itself, that it is judged on its own terms, that in the end nothing but the text matters. Not the book jacket, not the categories or genre the book is placed into, nothing. Only the book. I respectfully disagree with this optimistic view. I don't think books speak entirely for themselves. If they did, women's novels would not have been discriminated against and forgotten to the degree that they have been throughout history, and publishers and publications would not be publishing and reviewing far more books by men. If the gender of a book's author were not revealed to anyone ever, I doubt there would be such huge inequalities in which books are published, reviewed, studied in schools, and revered as classics. In a passage in her novel, The Blazing World, Siri Hustvedt describes the Goldberg study, a real experiment first conducted in 1968, which found that female students evaluated an essay or a work of art more harshly when a female name was attached to it. The essays or artworks were identical, but the students liked them better if they thought a man had created them. When the experiment was repeated many years later, this time with both female and male students, the same results were found. Hustvedt sums up this soul-crushing reality exquisitely. Quote, "All intellectual and artistic endeavors, even jokes, ironies, and parodies, fare better in the mind of the crowd when the crowd knows that somewhere behind the great work or the great spoof, it can locate a cock and a pair of balls." End quote. When I described to Marian Ettlinger the original thought I had been wearing and what it had mutated into, she was very understanding. She commiserated. I then wiped away the thought and we resumed our session. When it was over and we were sitting at the little table before the beautiful tray of goodies, I could tell there was something she wanted to say. Finally, she said, "The photos will be exactly what you asked for." This was clearly a warning. I knew she thought the photos might not look good in the traditional sense. They wouldn't be pretty or beautiful. She was preparing me for a possible shock. She said she would not normally produce photos like these for a woman. She would find more graceful poses, search for more flattering angles. I told her that I understood, that I knew these photos might not look as beautiful as her usual ones, and that I was grateful she'd been willing to honor my preference. I assured her that whatever the results were, they would be entirely my responsibility. The portraits were indeed exactly what I had asked for. Using one as my author photo took some resolve. A friend told me her biggest concern was my hand, which I had deliberately folded into a fist. She said it looked huge in the foreground, like a boxer's hand, as though I were about to punch someone. She said I should crop the photo so that the hand wouldn't show. When I sent the final image to the publisher, I included a note in caps above and below the photo, as well as in the body of the email. It said, "Important, do not crop." And then my book just came out in France, and the French publisher hated that photo so much, he ended up not putting any photo on the book. That's it, thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Clavel. I think that's a sample of Amanda's brilliance and wit. Her books are absolutely charming, and as she is. And she'll take a few questions. She's shy, but you don't have to be. Who's got a question? The man in the front.
Wasn't there a woman who wanted to? Now I'm afraid to ask. Question is, how can somebody so brave be afraid of anything? Like talking, or, you know, I think I know the answer, that all writers are afraid and brave. That was your point, that to put yourself out there in the world is, especially in today's world where everything is everywhere and wicked media can get you, or anything can get you, that it takes a lot of courage to do that. But then why be shy at all if you're so courageous?
It's, well, he told me, Lewis told me he didn't want me to read, he wanted me to just talk. And I thought, oh my God, how am I going to talk for half an hour? No, but I'm not going to remember everything to fill up a whole half hour. It'll be only 5 minutes. And so I was nervous about that. And then also, usually when I do a reading, I never look up. And I think, well, who cares about looking up? It's not important. That's a detail. So I've never looked up as much as today in my life. I've made such efforts to look up. So, you know, it's that kind of, I don't know, it's that kind of thing.
Norman?
I'm okay. I enjoyed very much your discursive but very brilliant talk. And the question that I would like to ask you is, what is Nude Men about? And does it fit within the definition of obscenity that was given some time ago by Justice Potter Stewart? He knew it when he saw it.
Wow, that's a tough question.
It's a great book, Norman.
It's
I'm just being,
yeah. I was worried when it, you know,
nobody appreciates my sense.
before it came out, I was a bit worried because of the topic, and I thought I could get into trouble. People might be very unhappy. But it turns out, I guess because of the way it's written or something, it doesn't offend people.
What is the topic?
Do I have to say? Okay. The topic is, it's about a 29-year-old man who's kind of average, normal, and he's not particularly a pedophile. And then a very tall, developed, mature 11-year-old girl starts coming on to him, you know, sexually, like gets obsessed with him. And I just was interested in how would a normal man would react if he's in that situation. I knew it would be a combination of very uncomfortable, and yet part of him might be attracted, which would horrify him, and he would feel guilty, and she relentlessly pursues him, and he tries to resist her, and then it goes from there. So in America, not a single person objected or acted shocked. It got reviewed a lot, mostly very favorably. There was only one, when I went to Holland, I had to be on this live TV show, and he told me, they came to the dressing room in advance and they encouraged me to try to like fight with the audience, and you know, it's that kind of show, I guess, which I didn't know. And so I assumed they did the same thing, same coaching to the audience. So I refused to fight. I was extremely calm and didn't fight at all, but one member of the audience said, "Don't come near my daughter." That was the most I ever got, the most objection I ever got from that book.
Well, based on what you're saying, I don't think it's obscenity. It has redeeming social value.
Okay.
You put that on the cover. Okay, Bernie.
Does anyone actually trust Wikipedia?
In fact, I was surprised to hear that they have editors. So,
Well, they don't, it's, what they call editors is normal people like you and me, volunteers, you just go on there and you make changes, and then they're called editors. It's anybody, if you go on Wikipedia right now and do a change, you are a Wikipedia editor.
yeah, well, that's what I thought, and that's why I think nobody trusts Wikipedia, because they don't know
Yeah.
where it comes from, it's not vetted.
And yet,
It's not
far too
actually
many
edited.
people trust Wikipedia. And the tragedy is that then even journalists, when journalists are in a hurry, they get on Wikipedia, they get their facts, they put them in their story. Once it's in a story, then then Wikipedia can use it as a reliable source to justify their own lies. And it's...
Well, I've always, I write lots of op-eds and commentaries, and I've always avoided Wikipedia.
Yeah.
In fact, they often have stuff that is very tempting to use.
Yeah.
But I will always find some other source
Mhm.
that says the same thing,
Yeah.
or, you know, it's more trustworthy
Yeah.
than Wikipedia.
And people who hate Wikipedia have done tests, experiments, where they put in lies deliberately to prove how they never get caught. And years go by, and these lies just continue, and then they spread into regular media, you know, and they become thought of as facts.
Who else has a question? Bernard?
I take it that you agree with the American view rather than the French view, that courses in creative writing can actually teach something useful.
I think I'm not sure how much it necessarily teaches you about writing, but it does so many other things. It can help you discover a talent you never would have discovered by forcing you to do something you have no urge to do, but then once you do it, you realize you love it and you love everything about it. It can do that. Also being around people like in an MFA program who all want the same thing, it's very stimulating and exciting, and it's encouraging. So, and occasionally it might teach you some little thing about writing, you know. Like the first thing I was ever taught when I was 13, my first short story, I didn't know yet how to write dialogue, so I would write a piece of dialogue, he said, da-da, she said. For every single line, he said, she said, and the teacher would go, oh no, you don't do that. You know? So that can be useful, you know.
Anyone else? Leah?
Did you ever consider publishing the op-ed anonymously? And what made you change your mind, if you ever considered?
Did you ever consider publishing the op-ed anonymously, and what made her change her mind?
What made me change my mind about what?
Having your name on the op-ed about the Wikipedia.
I never
bias.
I never considered publishing it anonymously, and therefore I didn't change my mind because.
Okay.
But the thing is, it didn't even enter my mind. I don't know why. As an option, I did.
Roa?
I just want to thank you for a very charming talk.
Thank you.
Roa is thanking Amanda for a wonderful talk.
Thanks very much.
We all agree?